He stood neck deep in the ocean, waiting as the cold slowed down his heart. But when authorities arrived, they just stood on the shore and watched. They called the Coast Guard, but the boat never arrived. A woman tried to rescue him, but police told her not to. And even when the man collapsed, they did nothing. Finally, a civilian pulled him to shore, but it was too late. The family sued, arguing that authorities should have saved him. They said it wasn't their responsibility to save the man's life, and a judge agreed, throwing the case out. He stuffed a note in a bottle and threw it over the waterfall. You see, the family had hiked to the falls and tried to climb down, but the rope that was usually there had disappeared. The journey back would take 3 days, and the canyon walls were too steep to take a shortcut. So the father pulled out a receipt and wrote "Stuck at waterfall. Get help." The message went over the falls and floated for a quarter mile until another group of hikers found it. They called for help and a helicopter rescued the family just hours later. He dropped the needle onto her eye accidentally, so he took it out and handed her a wet tissue before continuing to do the root canal. But the bacteria from her mouth started growing inside her eye, and soon enough, she woke up with a severe infection. She rushed to the hospital, and even though the doctors tried everything, her eye eventually had to be cut out. She sued the dentist for not giving her protective glasses, which could have easily prevented the accident that left her permanently half blind. If CPR doesn't work, they'll declare you dead. But then the doctor will wait, watching you closely as they time 10 minutes, since you could suddenly gasp for air. Now, nobody knows exactly why this happens, but some say it's because CPR can overfill your lungs, which could put pressure on your heart. And once they stop and declare you dead, that pressure goes down, allowing your heart to suddenly start beating again, bringing you back from the dead and terrifying the doctor. When you push a wheelbarrow through grass, the wheel will bounce and nearly tip over. But if you push it down the same path again, the grass will start to bend more. Keep repeating it, and the wheel starts to carve a shallow groove into the dirt. Over time, it fits perfectly in that track. It gets so deep that trying to go anywhere else becomes difficult because the wheel keeps falling back into the rut. Your brain works the same way. The first time you check your phone out of boredom, you have to think about it. But repeat it enough times, and you find yourself reaching for your phone on default all of the time, stuck in the rut that you carved for yourself. As the trunk of the tree died, its branches collapsed to the ground. But deep inside the soil, the roots stayed alive. A new trunk pushed up through the earth, and the tree was reborn, only to die and regrow, century after century. When researchers finally found it and sampled the preserved roots, tests showed they were over 9,000 years old, meaning the tree had been alive since the end of the last ice age. Layer the pasta, sauce, and cheese directly onto a heavy-duty foil and wrap it tightly so no water can get inside. Then place the packet on the bottom rack of the dishwasher and start the normal wash cycle, choosing the sanitize settings for extra heat. As the dishwasher runs, the hot water and steam heat up the foil, which slowly cooks the lasagna inside. And once the cycle finishes, you should end up with a dishwasher lasagna that's ready to eat. He bent a rubber belt and attached it to the front of his tire, repeating it for each wheel. Then he drove onto a road full of crabs. You see, they were migrating to the ocean, but it would take weeks for all of them to cross, making it impossible to drive. By adding the belts, the crabs were gently nudged, giving them enough time to scuttle away before the car rolled forward to safety. The chimp learned sign language as she grew up and was treated like part of the family. But when she tried to have babies of her own, they both tragically died. After that, she stopped eating and barely talked to her owners, except to make the sign for baby over and over again. Years later, a volunteer got pregnant. and the chimp was fascinated by her growing belly and constantly asked about the child. But just like the chimp, the woman tragically lost her baby. When they saw each other again, the woman explained, "My baby died." The chimp looked her in the eyes, then slowly put her fingers to her cheeks, making the sign for cry, before giving the grieving mother a comforting hug. They built legs on the research station to keep it off the ground. You see, if the snow collected on the building, it would harden into ice, eventually burying the entire thing. But the legs allowed snow to blow underneath. And if the snow starts to pile up, hydraulics lift the legs one at a time, while snow is packed under them until the whole thing is raised. And if a crack starts to form in the ice nearby, ski-shaped feet allow it to be towed one module at a time before it's put back together in a safer location. He sold the hot dogs for only 5 cents, but his competitors told everyone that low prices meant bad quality, making his stand look suspicious. As the legend goes, the owner hired a group of men to wear white lab coats while eating hot dogs at his stand, making them look like doctors from a nearby hospital. This led to people thinking that if doctors liked them, the hot dogs must be safe to eat. So the stand finally started getting more and more customers and eventually became one of America's biggest hot dog brands today. The piglet was born with paralyzed back legs, so he was brought to the vet to be put down. But the vet felt bad for him and took the piglet home, where he used his son's K'NEX toys to build him a tiny wheelchair. At first, the piglet hated it, but after a few days, he started using it to scoot around. A video of him went viral, and after he started outgrowing the wheelchair, a company even sent them a replacement, making sure he could run around freely for the rest of his life. If you draw a half circle with a radius of 1, the curved edge will measure pi. Now, if you split that curve into 2 smaller half circles, their curves will still add up to pi. Then split them again and again, making more and more tiny curves. Eventually, the shape starts to look flat, like a straight line that's twice as long as the radius. But the curves never actually become straight, because even when they get extremely small, those pieces are still curves that always add up to pi. When a shark attacks someone, it immediately makes the news. Because of this, you might think they're really deadly, but sharks only kill about 10 people each year. Now, snakes are much deadlier, killing about 10,000 times that amount. And humans are even worse, murdering about 400,000 other humans each year. But the true champion of death is the tiny mosquito. Its bites spread diseases that cause over 700,000 deaths every year, making it the deadliest animal in the world by far. If you could scale an onion to over 600 feet wide, you would need chainsaws to slice off the top, then flip it stem side down with huge cranes and cut it into 16 sections, pulling the layers outward with thick cables until it fully blooms. Next, use a helicopter to cover it with 800 tons of flour, before using fire trucks to spray on eggs and milk, and topping it with even more flour. Finally, fill a crater with boiling oil and lower the onion inside. When you take it back out, you'll have a blooming onion the size of the Colosseum, enough to feed almost 13 million people. He dunked them under the water, but he didn't see the crocodile creeping towards him as he moved to the next person waiting, and it shot out of the water towards the man. Its jaws bit into his back and legs as he tried to escape. Fishermen rushed in with nets and managed to pull the man away, but it was too late. By the time they reached him, he had already died. When an elephant collapses, some herds stop walking and stand quietly around her as she dies, reaching down with their trunks and trying to lift her back up. But when she does finally die, they touch her body again and again, and will sometimes even cover it with branches and dirt. Now, weeks later, if they pass her bones, they will stop and gently touch them as a way to recognize her remains. Fold the paper diagonally both ways to make an X, before folding it in half lengthwise and crosswise. Then flatten out the paper before pressing it into a triangle. Next, flip up one corner and tuck it into the center, twisting it to make a wing. Repeat this for all sides and blow into the tip to inflate it. Finally, flatten out the wings to make a spinning paper balloon. If you grew a 1-year-old to the same size as Shaq, it would stretch up to 7 feet tall and weigh over 300 pounds. To feed it, you would need over 10 times the amount of baby food, with a jug of milk at every meal. And because it could pee up to 10 pounds a day, you would have to buy hundreds of XXL diapers to change it. But with a bigger mouth, it would have a much stronger bite, which could be dangerous. And if it tripped and fell on you, well, it probably wouldn't end well. If you press chocolate ice cream against vanilla ice cream, for some reason, it's like they perfectly transfer over without mixing. And this happens because they don't slide smoothly apart. The surfaces stick together. And as the ice cream pushes past each other, some of it starts stretching, forming a thin layer that clings to the other scoop. When the two cones get pulled apart, the layer tears, and you get left with matching patches that look completely unmixed. His cat was tragically killed by a car, so naturally, he decided to skin it and preserved its hide with chemicals. Next, he built a custom frame with 4 propellers, then stretched the hide over it and positioned it so the weight stayed centered and the propellers could spin. At first, it tilted to one side, but when he adjusted the weight again, the cat finally lifted off the ground. He later did the same with a rat and an ostrich, turning them all into drones. The tubes are filled with water, which travels to a tank that sits on top of the boat. And when a candle is lit underneath, some of the water turns to steam, which creates an expanding bubble in the tank. This forces water out of the end of the boat. But since the pipes are cooler than the tank, the air shrinks again and moves back toward the tank, sucking in water from the lake. The air expands again when it heats up and shrinks once it cools down, and this constant movement pushes the boat along without any moving parts. His wife was sitting beside him. The kids were sleeping in the back seat. The road stretched, quiet and dark. Then headlights cut across the line. When he came to, they were gone. His family was dead because of a drunk driver, and he was all alone. Now, 20 years later, he's retelling the story for the 100th time to his psychiatrist. She had adjusted his medication many times, but nothing seemed to help. He was numb. He just couldn't enjoy life. So she suggested an experimental clinic that claimed it could completely erase specific memories. This would be perfect for him. He had been struggling with this weight for too long. He agreed, desperate to forget his trauma, signing all the waivers without hesitation. Anything to make the pain disappear. At the clinic, a nurse prepared him for the procedure, noticing his trembling hands and downcast eyes. Then the lead scientist asked him to recall every detail: the collision, the screaming metal, the silence afterward. He poured it all out so the machine could trace the neural pathways and find his memory. They sedated him and the procedure began. It was supposed to be quick, but the system kept failing to lock onto the memory. The screen showed inconsistent data. The scientist grew frustrated. They sedated him deeper, forcing the machine to dig harder. In the control room, the nurse began to research records of his family to try and help, but she couldn't find anything. There was no marriage record for him, no children, nothing. She found an article about the car crash, And to her horror, she saw the man's face in a mugshot. He was the drunk driver that night. He was the one that killed the family. And he was about to forget it all. The two penguins fell in love and spent 10 years courting each other until one day she suddenly dumped him for a younger male. This broke his heart and left him completely alone in his old age. But when the zoo ran a promotion for an anime, they placed a cardboard cutout from the show in his enclosure. Now, it was a cartoon penguin girl, and as soon as he saw it, he stood there and stared at her for hours. And for months, he refused to leave her side. Now, he eventually got sick, and some say the cutout was brought to his bedside so that she was the last thing he saw as he passed away. The sacks would be inserted inside your wrists, with small openings right before your palms. Your bones would also be thickened with steel rods, and your joints reinforced with braces. Every time you ate, the sacks would spin the protein in your food, hardening it to liquid silk. And when you flicked your wrist, your muscles would flex, squeezing the sack to shoot the silk out. But even though it might stick to a building, it would probably just snap under your weight. Line a deep pan with the dough, then spread a little sauce around the outside edge and cover the bottom with a thick layer of shredded mozzarella. Then lay a second layer of dough over the cheese and pinch tiny holes all over the top. These holes let steam escape while it cooks. Then pinch the edges of the crust to seal it all together and trim off any extra dough. Finally, spread a thick layer of sauce across the top. Then bake it for 30 minutes, creating a stuffed Chicago-style pizza. An avalanche broke loose, rushing toward him. It buried him for 15 minutes straight. Now, he was eventually rescued, but when he tried to play Sudoku a few weeks later, his arms started shaking uncontrollably. You see, while he was buried, the lack of oxygen had injured his brain, and whenever he tried to picture the patterns, his brain blasted way more neurons than usual, which overloaded his body and sent him into a seizure. So even though Sudoku was one of his favorite hobbies, he had to give it up completely. The donkey was spooked while hiking with his owners. At first, his owners tried to look for him, but they eventually gave up. And years later, a hiker spotted a herd of elk. They were all following the donkey. You see, he had joined their herd when he got lonely. But when he protected them from mountain lions, they accepted him as their leader. And he still wanders with the elk to this day. Once a year, they open his tomb and use a sponge to soak up the liquid around the bones before squeezing it into a bottle. You see, the saint was buried over 1,000 years ago, but legend says a mysterious liquid appeared in his tomb and pooled around his bones. So his followers mixed it with holy water and gave it to sick people to heal them. When scientists tested it, they found it was mostly just water and minerals. But regardless, it's still used for healing to this day. They locked the chicken inside and tied the cage to the roof of the car. Now, if they drove into a deadly gas, the chicken would immediately die, warning the soldiers to put on gas masks. You see, the heavy pollution in the air clogged up their chemical detectors, and they kept randomly going off. But chickens are super sensitive to changes in air quality, so the soldiers bought over 40 of them. But the harsh desert conditions killed most of the chickens, and the plan was scrapped. He built a cylinder out of Legos, adding a piston inside. Then he repeated this hundreds of times before stacking them together and connecting them to bottles of compressed air. Next, he built a shell for the outside before adding wheels on the sides. When the air was released, it rushed through the cylinders and pumped the pistons up and down, turning the gears and spinning the wheels with nothing but air. But the engine was a lot weaker than a normal car, so it was barely faster than riding a bike. He was arrested for killing a teenager, but he insisted he was at a baseball game that night. Even though he had his ticket stubs, the police weren't convinced, and the footage of the audience was too blurry to confirm anything. Then the man remembered a camera crew was filming a sitcom in the stadium that night, and when they looked through the footage, they saw the man sitting in the audience around the time the murder was happening miles away. His phone records also proved it was really him, and he was finally freed thanks to the sitcom. If you bite a pistachio that won't open, the pressure can sometimes fracture your enamel, and using your fingers to peel it might hurt your skin over time. So instead, grab half of an old shell and wedge it into the thin line before twisting it sharply. This puts all the force on the weakest part, letting you crack it open in seconds. And if the pistachio is completely sealed, cover it with a towel and tap it with a heavy pan. He climbed into the bed, and within a few hours, the patient lying there passed away. You see, the cat lived in a nursing home, and he would often nap next to patients. But the nurses noticed that whichever bed he chose, the patient usually died the same day. Now, some people think he smelled tiny chemical changes in the people about to die, while others think it was just a coincidence. But he predicted over 50 deaths. So much that the staff began calling families whenever he showed up, letting them say goodbye before their loved ones passed. If you broke a thermometer on the plane, the mercury could slowly eat through the aluminum, where the metals could react together, breaking it down into weak, spaghetti-thin strands that can snap with almost no force. Left alone, it could tear a hole through the aircraft. But there's one catch. Aluminum protects itself with a layer of oxide, so unless it hits a scratch in the perfect spot, it probably won't do much damage. He put on the glasses, which flipped everything upside down in his vision, and at first, he could hardly use his limbs. In a sword fight, he would aim up when he should have aimed down. But as he practiced, his brain started to turn the image the right way. So even when an object appeared at the top of his glasses, his hand reached down. After a few weeks, he could do everything normally. But when he finally took them off, his brain flipped that image upside down, meaning he was lost again, until his brain finally caught up a few minutes later. The live wire fell on him, sending over 7,000 volts through his body. He was so burned that he lost both his legs and one of his arms. And doctors had to replace huge patches of his skin. But this destroyed his sweat glands, meaning he couldn't sweat, which meant he couldn't cool down. Instead, he had to use an air conditioner constantly so he wouldn't overheat. But one day, the power went out, which meant the AC went out, and he was found dead the next day. If a human is buried underneath the rubble, but they're still living, their heartbeat will make tiny movements in their chest, while their breathing expands their lungs. This is enough to be picked up by the radar and detected by this special device. Even if the person is unconscious, it still sends a signal back, telling rescuers that someone is down there. Hammer in 3 nails, but not all the way. Then snip the heads off of each one and hammer them further through the joint until the metal sits deeper inside. Then place another nail on top and tap it with a hammer to push the nails slightly below the surface. Now put glue in each hole and wedge in wooden plugs. Saw the plugs so they're the same height as the board and sand the surface smooth, making the nails invisible. The ants climbed onto the plank, which was then loaded into a boat and shipped to a different country, where they started their own colony. And this happened countless times, until these ants were spread all over the world. But even after a century of living thousands of miles apart, their chemical smells are still super similar. And if you put together two of these ants from two different continents, they'll still act like they're from the same colony. He found a bowl of honey sitting on the road and decided to eat it as a snack. And the other soldiers found more, and they did the same thing. But soon after, they started vomiting and got terrible diarrhea. They even acted drunk, barely able to stand. You see, the bees in that area collected nectar from poisonous flowers, which transferred into the honey. And the enemy knew this. So he collected the honey before leaving it out to make the soldiers sick. And once they were weak, the army attacked, killing hundreds of confused men and winning the battle, all thanks to the honey. Imagine you licked a wet banana. Now you can probably feel it in detail on your tongue, even though you've never done it. Why is this? Well, your brain already knows what a banana peel feels like. It also knows what wet and slippery feel like from other things you may have licked. Your brain takes those pieces and assembles a prediction. So you're not remembering the sensation, you're building it in real time. The brain does this to predict the world before you touch it. That way you can decide what to avoid without learning the hard way. He climbed up a tall stone pillar and sat down to pray. But crowds of people started showing up for religious advice, distracting him from praying. So he climbed up an even taller pillar and had his food and water pulled up through ropes. For decades, he endured rainstorms and intense heat, and legend says that when his mother died, he even had her body moved there so he could say goodbye. After about 40 years, he finally died, bent forward in prayer, and he was buried by the same crowds he avoided in life. You would pause the movie, hit print on the remote, and inside the TV, the paused image is copied from the screen into the printer's memory. After converting the signal into color data, the printer feeds in a blank sheet, then runs heated color panels over it in precise patterns, matching the paused frame exactly. Once the colors are in place, the sheet is laminated, and the finished photo slides out of the TV as you resume your movie. Mix 3 cups of sugar with 1 cup of water, then heat it up while stirring. Once it's clear, pour the hot syrup into a glass jar. Next, cut a clean piece of string, about 2/3 the length of the jar, and tie it to a stick. Dip the string in the syrup, then let it dry hard, before balancing the stick on top of the jar, so the string hangs inside without touching the sides. As the liquid cools, it will release sugar particles, which will form crystals along the string. And after a week, you'll have a hard chunk of rock candy. Fold up a tea towel and wrap your thumb in it. Then lay it on the table and wedge the oyster under your thumb, with the hinge facing out. Push the knife between the shells and twist it to separate them. Then slide the blade around until the lid comes off. Finally, cut the mussel out of the shell and suck it out. But if a grain of sand had found its way into your oyster, it could be covered in a protective layer, which could have turned it into a pearl. So you should always check your oysters before swallowing them. He fell onto the tracks, and the train rolled over his legs, slicing them off. When he recovered, he struggled to work at his railway job, so he bought a baboon and brought it to work. It copied the man by watching him, and whenever the baboon heard the train whistles, it learned to pull the right levers, switching the tracks. After testing it for its skills, the railway officials hired it full-time, paying it 20 cents and half a beer. And for the next 9 years, legend says it never made a single mistake. He slipped through the bars of a second-floor balcony. His body fell through the gap, but his head got stuck, leaving him hanging in the air. People on the street saw him and rushed to stack nearby chairs into a tower. Then one man climbed up and grabbed the boy's legs, holding his weight to keep his neck from being crushed. For several minutes, he held him up until the boy's grandma got inside the apartment and pulled the toddler back up, completely unharmed.
আপনি এখানে শুয়ে আছেন কেন?
এই নে তোর চা।
তোকে এরকম উদ্ভ্রান্তের মতো লাগছে কেন? জি
সুন্দর।
এই যায়।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
আমাদের শহর কেমন লাগছে?
এখনো বুঝে উঠতে পারিনি।
আমি যেন সেই কাজ করি ভালো মনে।
আমি শুভ, এখানে নতুন এসেছি।
টুম্পা তোর সাথে কথা বলবে।
কেন? আমি বিরক্ত করলে তোমার সমস্যা না? আর 5 জন এসে বিরক্ত করে তাতে
জাফর আমার এক্স হাজবেন্ড।
শেষ পর্যন্ত তোমার বুদ্ধি হলো। যাক, এটা ভালো।
না আমি তন্নি, এখানেই থাকি।
আচ্ছা, না আমি এই রাস্তা দিয়ে যাচ্ছিলাম, হঠাৎ
কিন্তু এই 4 লাইন তোমরা বাসায় প্র্যাকটিস করবা, ঠিক আছে?
ও এটা, আরে এটা অচেনা শহর, অচেনা মানুষ।
একজনকে তো অন্তত ছিল।
হ্যালো, আমি শুভ।
শাবাশ। পরের 4 লাইন আবার আমরা আগামীকাল শিখব। কি কি হয়েছে বলেন তো?
জীবনটা
কে ভাইয়া, কেমন আছিস?
কেমন আছিস রে? পড়াশোনা? আসসালামু আলাইকুম মা, কেমন আছো? টুম্পা কেমন আছে?
আমি ভালো আছি।
কোনো সমস্যা হচ্ছে না?
কথা বলবেন না কিন্তু আমার
উল্টা পাল্টা কথা কি এর দেখছো? উল্টা পাল্টা কিসের কথা দেখ?
অবাক হলেন? বছরখানেক আগে পারিবারিকভাবে দুই ঘরের নামতা। দুই ঘরের নামতা এখন আমি জিজ্ঞেস করব।
কি হয়েছে?
কান্নাকাটি করছিল জন্য আজকে ওর জন্য পিস্তল নিয়ে এসেছি, ভালোই হলো।
হ্যাঁ, সেটাও ভাবছি, আবার এও ভাবছি যে এরকম একজন প্রভাবশালী।
আপনার লুক ভালো, তাই আপনি হিরো হতে পারতেন।
অবস্থা খারাপ করে
ভালো অ্যাক্টিং করেন।
হ্যাঁ, হিরোতে পারতাম না। ওটা বাড়ি থেকে ফোন, মিথ্যা না বলি।
ব্যবসা করেন, অনেক বড় ব্যবসা।
বাইকটা নষ্ট হয়ে গেল। অনেকদিন পর বাচ্চাদেরকে এভাবে দেখলাম, খুব ভালো লাগছে, সুন্দর।
চিন্তার কি আর শেষ আছে রে মা?